Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here. I'm Jackie Terraza. I'm the Women's Board Endowed Chair of Learning and Public Engagement here at the Art Institute of Chicago. And today, it's my pleasure that we will present the amazing Darby English. His talk will draw from aspects of his recent book, 1971, A Year in the Life of Color. And in fact, for those of you who are interested, the book will be on sale after today's talk in our shop. And the book examines the cultural politics at play in the year 1971 when two exhibitions opened to the public: Contemporary Black Artists in America at the Whitten Museum of American Art and the Deluxe Show in a renovated movie theater in Houston. And in looking at these exhibitions, English asked us to consider how artists position themselves relative to the politics of their time, and how a specific group of artists working in the late 60s and 70s refused compromise, using the very aesthetics of their work against normative expectations. English is somebody who uses the most rigorous forms of object study and archive research to surface stories that work against the grain of the canon. At the University of Chicago, he is the Carl Darling Buck Professor of Art History and the College, and he is also an associate faculty member in the Department of Visual Arts and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. He serves as adjunct curator in the Department of Paintings and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and his writing has appeared in Art Bulletin, Art Forum, International Review of African American Art, and other venues. In addition to being the author of the book that is the subject of this talk, he is the author of the great work, How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness, and he co-edited the volume Art History and Emergency and Kara Walker, Narratives of a Negress. A new monograph to describe a life, essays at the intersection of art and race terror, will be published by Yale University Press in 2018. And for those, as I mentioned, for those interested, that book, the book 1971, A Year in the Life of Color, will be available after today's talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Darby.
Thanks so much, Jackie, for the invitation, and Michael Green, who has been amazingly attentive and courteous and warm throughout the process of bringing this event to fruition. I want to thank the Terra, especially Elizabeth and Amy, for their help making it happen, I guess. And lastly, all of you for coming in out of the warm on such a beautiful day to listen to me, hoping to make it worth your while. So let me get my water open. Okay. Take a minute with the epigraph if you haven't already. I'll come back to it in a moment, though. It was roughly like this. By the end of the 1960s, blackness had acquired a positing power equal to that of cultural keywords such as peace, freedom, and love. Identifying with it allowed one to occupy a whole set of positions on race, history, politics, and culture. As a term of art for cultural nationalists, blackness had a representational charge as puissant as its exact meaning was elusive. Now, the elusiveness itself of this historically specific concept, blackness, especially as it has structured approaches to representation, has generated strikingly little controversy or analysis. Histories of late art capitulate to the term far more often than they worry the particular operations that would attach it to particular people, things, and scenes in cultural history. In much of my work, I have tried to piece together the elements of an imaginary that has always resisted it, or embarrassed it, or otherwise provided means of doing either or both. At the end of the 60s, deliberately working color to ambiguous ends, a la the painter and critic Frank Bowling, who provides my epigraph this afternoon, provided quite a large number of artists, painters and sculptors alike, with one such means. Indeed, these artists emerged, produced their very best work, and found their most sympathetic and widest audiences at the precise moment when, through words spoken, attitudes adopted, and new images promulgated, blackness became a key axis in American political culture, I should say North American political culture. Now, none of these artists harbored even the slightest intention to offer up their work as a foil to race essentialism, but their works and actions, and those of their advocates, are themselves productive of a number of anti-essentialist logics that I have felt compelled to follow through. I have taken as my starting point the idea that it is only by abiding insistently with the particular nature and context of the actor's interventions and words that we will ever arrive at the more centrifugal effects of the relatedness of these otherwise incompatible ways of thinking color circa 1971. I have been concerned throughout this work not to assess the quality of the art made so much as that of the thought produced at this juncture. What the artists did, the significance given to their actions both then and since, the words they embraced, imported, or disputed. But as we will see, this thought can have no significance at all for the history of art without first being understood to emerge from what they made. In 1970, the art educator and curator Barry Gaither coined the term New Black Show to describe a novel form of art exhibition that would forge art and cultural nationalism into an indivisible union. Quote, reflecting the pressure of militant arts organizations, the New Black Show was mounted by a major museum or university. And thanks to the introduction of black organizers, it showed a greater sympathy and understanding of the art than faux pas such as Harlem on My Mind, pictured here in 3 iterations, could do, end quote. Harlem on My Mind was a notorious and infamous experiment of the Metropolitan Museum to bring black representation, or I should say representations of black people and places into its exhibition program, and it didn't really work. Indeed, the New Black Show was instrumental in putting pressure on museums to be mindful of the relationship between the often very narrow public for which they program and the larger one that they actually serve. But in their effort to represent communities by the exhibition of highly idiosyncratic works of art, many New Black Shows often assigned art the task of transmitting a code or theme wholly incongruous with the artist's representational purposes and ambitions. Abstraction posed a particular problem for the New Black Show, but exhibitions barely registered this incongruity. Gaither's own groundbreaking 1970 exhibition, Afro-American Artists, New York and Boston, included the work of Malcolm Bailey, Bowling, from whom we've heard already, Barbara Chase-Riboud, Ed Clark, Norman Lewis, Al Loving, and Alma Thomas. None of these practitioners, all of them abstract, can be said to satisfy the claim that Gaither makes to introduce his exhibition in the accompanying catalog, namely that, quote, in his visual language, the black artist is basically a realist, end quote. Although often false, the claim itself is a crucial weapon in the black art expert's critical arsenal. Why? Because it allows one to hitch a racial essence to an art object with any number of material factors that, once permitted to speak in their own voices, totally undermine it. The openly conjectural character of these artists' work, its evident fixation on formal concerns, have no positive value in the black art expert's discourse. Now, those who would celebrate the emergence of the New Black Show as a progressive development in the history of culture are absolutely right to do so. It represents an extremely hard-won victory. But we need also to be able to account for the conspicuous overconfidence and entitlement with which the black art expert insists, for instance, that, quote, the black artist may not even be aware how blackness has affected him, but in critical situations, the influence will inevitably surface, end quote. That's Gaither again, speaking on a different occasion. Here again, we see at work a realist imperative that sets abstraction at a distance in order to conjure the work's relevance. For a while there, it was as though any black artist who valued the people's respect was expected to sacrifice her work to this strong critical or curatorial will just to be seen at all. What I want to stress here is that the only role that individuals play in this discourse is that of spokespeople and representatives of mass yearnings. The management by this discourse of abstract art in particular, and I should say abstract artists in further particular and more particular, makes glaringly evident the evidence of compulsion at work in the New Black Show. More than any other phenomena, phenomenon, a black artist doing abstraction undermined the explanatory power of the show and the expert alike. To tell the full story of the historic struggle for representation taking place in this period, then, we have to consider the figure of the black modernist, whose activity is precisely what the struggle had to reject in order to achieve itself. I'm going to be discussing this work here and this here, which is photographed anew, and this is just a comparandum to get a feel for what Sue Irons, now known as Senga Ngudi, was doing at this period. Water Composition 4, 1970, is a spare floor-bound sculpture by Sue Irons. It comprises a clear vinyl bag partly filled with water dyed blue, the bag twisted into a loosely biomorphic formation and set just inside the perimeter of a 10-foot loop of coir rope, across whose width Irons has tied a crude knot. The work partakes of a constructional vocabulary of extreme simplicity and suggestion, but one is tempted to describe both its components and its totality as willfully elusive. Set upon the floor, it appears the instrument or prop of an agent who is missing, and perhaps yet to arrive. It perpetrates such open metaphors against any necessity of meaning, which would be a quite gratuitous point were it not for the context in which one would have first encountered it in 1971. The work debuted in Henri Ghent's 8 Afro-American Artists, which he organized for the Raff Museum in Geneva, Switzerland. In an article promoting the exhibition, Ghent illustrated Irons's piece alongside a sculpture by Fred Eversley, untitled 1971, itself a roughly semicircular block of layered acrylic resin that rests on a tangent, opposite of which the work's upper boundary rises gently to a peak at center. Untitled's adamantly unpoetic form and use of what we used to call space age materials lend it a palpable contemporaneity, even today. This is a machine-finished work of intricately wrought design, its madeness more technical than manual. Its machined facture betrays Eversley's long apprenticeship in the fabrication techniques specific to aerospace engineering. Every bit as much as the object's jaunty opticality denotes the artist's commitment to formal rather than narrative ends. I think just a moment's reflection on the errant retentiveness of these two objects, one imperfect circle and another incomplete one, starts to undo the enclosing rhetoric of the new black show. Neither work assumes anything about the condition of color. Instead, in a questing mood, each asks about the shape in which the artist has found color. Within the imaginary typified by the new black show, however, a color-oriented visual art that fails somehow to evince its racial character only defers to the dominant culture's most excluding practices rather than openly defying them. True to form, then, Henri Ghent corrects Irons and Eversley's lapses in this regard. And here in the quotation, I would ask you just to listen for the yearning to normalize these artists. According to Ghent, 8 Afro-American artists presented, quote, a potent art of concrete orientation created by individuals who call upon the best aspects of their African heritage, together with the temperament formed by their forced acculturation in America, end quote. At this juncture, art done right would establish continuities between black subjects and the primordial ideas and forms that are ours alone. Heritage had both a form and a face. Self-knowledge comes from the outside in, from model institutions and cultural forms, including the black art expert who embodies the aesthetic appetite of the collective. By the conform or perish logic of the new black show, the expert's prerogative was all that one really needed to bring a black modernist into line. Of course, emergency conditions provide an ideal habitat for such critical tendencies. What demands that we tell a different story is not only the dissatisfying intellectual character of these readings, by which I don't mean their badness so much as the sense that one gets in listening to them that the writers knew that their analytical systems were terribly out of sync with their subjects, but somehow couldn't help themselves. What demands a different story is the sheer amount of historically crucial activity that becomes invisible under this optic. For instance, just before racialist aesthetics had congealed into a full-blown politics, the New York Times' James R. Mello reviewed a 1969 exhibition at the Studio Museum of Harlem, in Harlem, that presented abstract works by 4 artists, 3 of them black, 1 of them white. They were Mel Edwards, Sam Gilliam, Stephen Kelsey, and William T. Williams. Here, Mello considered the peculiar effect abstraction has on black representational space. Quote, "The attempt to promote a specifically black art, as opposed to art created by black artists, underscores the disadvantages and the radical integrity of abstraction. Although abstract art must invariably seem a failure in confrontation with the demand for revolutionary communications, it also carries a strongly resistant charge. The tension Mello observed in the Studio Museum exhibition was, I think, a clear symptom of integration's impact on cultural formation in the contemporary United States. Yet his review is one of a strikingly small number of efforts by art world commentators to grasp this, or any element of abstraction's challenge to static representations of culture. The heterogeneous character of new artistic formations introduced a certain precariousness into the culture. Here's Mello again. One hopes that viewers will recognize that art in which formal considerations count as heavily cannot be drafted into political service without damage to its basic intentions." End quote. Such art entailed neither a rejection of the black world nor a blind embrace of the white one. This art, Mello found, and I think, again, correctly, must make its way through a world of fine gray distinctions. It found a measure of its meaning in the increasingly heavy traffic between the so-called black community and so-called white art world. Curated for the Whitney Museum of American Art by Robert A. Mack Doty, Contemporary Black Artists in America, which will be the main focus of the duration of the talk today, was a group showing of 58 artists' work that ran from April 6 to May 16, 1971. This exhibition boldly mobilized what Don L. Lee, in a very different context, called color distortion, which was his pejorative term for transracial or interracial cultural production. Rare indeed have been such striking refusals as Doty's of both the social practice embodied by the New Black Show and of the institutionalization of what was once known as the black perspective. Interestingly, to say the very least, exhibitions like this have virtually no art history. What little accounting the Whitney Show has received invariably originates from the perspective of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, whose founding members included Benny Andrews and Amiri Baraka, from whom we've already heard a little bit. The BECC formed in April 1969 during the protests of Harlem on My Mind. Discussions with Whitney officials followed shortly thereafter, as well as with the officials in charge of all the major New York museums, focusing on what the museums could do to meet the needs of the black community. These were newly articulate and newly urgent needs, and the coalition was formed and activated precisely in order to state them as directly as they could to the most powerful people they could access. The Times issued the first public report of the BECC's negotiations with the Whitney on April 2, 1969. Quote, "The museum will stage a major," and major was put into scare quotes, "black artist exhibition next year and has established a fund for the acquisition of works by the younger and lesser known among them." End quote. This was said to satisfy 2 of the coalition's 5 demands. The other 3 were for the establishment of at least 5 annual one-man shows for black artists in the small gallery off the lobby, more black representation in the Whitney annuals, and a black curatorial staffer at the museum to coordinate all such efforts. By the time the Whitney brought off the survey exhibition in April of 1971, fully a year and a half after the agitation began, the museum had met all of the demands except for the very one that would have authenticated the exhibition, namely the appointment of a black curator. A September 18 memo from John Bauer, the Whitney's director, to its attorney indicates that the BECC had conceded this point early in the negotiations, but news reports continued to state that the expert question remained unresolved and a point of striking antagonism. We'll come back to the floor plan in a bit. I just wanted to give you a feel for the layout in case the surnames on the screen mean anything to you. The ECC's acceptance of these terms included an acknowledgement that the museum had selected Doty, a white man, to organize the survey, on the condition that he consult with black art experts. This was the formation used continually in all of the communication, almost all of which was recorded in print. Yet the winter of 1969-70 saw a flurry of communications about the way the selection of works was being handled. Already in March 1970, Ghent was speaking of what could have been about an exhibition that wasn't scheduled to open for another 13 months. Ghent warned Bauer in a letter, quote, "When you insist on allowing Mack to do this thing on his own, I think you are, in essence, inviting trouble. What could have been a meaningful signal of change has all the earmarks of the kind of paternalism we have come to expect." Then, in January 1971, Andrews and Cliff Joseph, co-chair of the coalition, wrote to Bauer of the BECC's intention to stage a massive demonstration in protest of the Whitney Museum's dishonoring our joint agreement as stated in the NYT, New York Times, October 2, 1969, end quote. As we have seen, this misstates the outcome of the coalition's agreement with Whitney officials. Enclosed with their letter, nonetheless, was an advance copy of a press release they had prepared. It concluded, and you see a portion of the conclusion on the screen here, "We of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, being dedicated to the principle of upholding the community's cultural integrity, see it as our responsibility to respond to these gross failures on the part of the Whitney with vigorous and relentless protest action. We are for a massive boycott of the Whitney Museum's Black Show by all concerned Black artists, all sympathetic members of the art community, and all people concerned with cultural freedom." And indeed, a 2-hour strike took place on January 31, 1971, and eventually 15 artists would drop out of the show in sympathy with their protesting colleagues. A little less than a month before the exhibition opened, Andrews told the Atlanta Journal that Doty didn't utilize, this is a quote from Benning, didn't utilize any advice from anyone regarding the field of Black art, and that visits and selections of exhibition objects were not made according to criteria acceptable to the Black professional artists, end quote. This is the sort of activity that typically counts as political in histories of late art. Whatever it opposes becomes apolitical or retrograde. In such a situation, the actually progressive character of Doty's actions becomes difficult to recover. In fact, museum records show that the coalition's claims about Doty's consultation of Black art experts and artists and art professionals to be fully false. Reflecting a multi-level effort to devise an institution-appropriate response to BECC demands, these records also reveal the scope and intensity of Doty's endeavor to learn his subject and extensively to involve Black art experts, both in this process and the exhibition planning. These efforts appear to have occupied Doty fully, in fact, during the winter and spring of 1970. Over this period, he corresponded or visited with the very authorities the coalition had suggested he contact, and many more. Both Bauer and Doty sought and received enthusiastic support from Black arts professionals in Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Providence. Claude Booker, chairman of the Black Arts Council of Los Angeles, pledged to furnish, quote, "all of the leads possible and acquaint you with all the professional Black artists we can contact with the opportunity you are offering," end quote. Through extensive letter writing with Driscoll and Henri Ghent both, Whitney officials came to a very keen understanding, in fact, of the divisions among Black art worlders. Ghent himself eventually insisted that his name not be listed in association with the show, but Driscoll, long the leading authority on historical Black art and artists, conveyed his support for both Doty and the overall project in the strongest terms. For its part, the BECC spent the same season launching its most comprehensive condemnations of the exhibition, which, again, would not open for over a year. What to make of the glaring inconsistency between the coalition's portrayals of Doty's process and the work he actually performed in realizing contemporary Black artists in America? The coalition's fixation on the matter of the black art expert shows that a major issue clearly was Doty's relation as a white man to black artists and the black community. Conceptually and actually, it was a matter, or rather problem, of integration, which was no longer a salutary goal in radical politics. Unlike the Whitney's undertaking, the new black show arose from an organic association. It was the near mystical work of experts who, to borrow a phrase from Benny Andrews, can read our people even when they're keeping their cool, as Ghent had read the stubbornly imperfect circles of Eversley and Irons, and in so doing ascertained what he considered their consummate use of vibrant color. As a white vision of some products of black experience, contemporary black artists in America was perhaps predestined to fail. But the role in the exhibition of abstract art was every bit as much of a problem. And I'm going to call the show CBAA from here on out because I'm losing time to the full articulation of the title. CBAA offered artists who sought an inspiration beyond the black experience the largest stage they had ever occupied. Indeed, during Ghent's exchanges with Bauer about Doty's right to organize the survey, it wasn't Doty himself who was at issue, but the artists that he and Marcia Tucker had presented in the solo exhibitions mounted at the Whitney since 1969. Quote, this is Ghent again. The consensus of opinion is that the black artists you've given one-man shows to will not pose a threat to anyone, hence the reason for their having been chosen. To put it another way, the focus on Doty was simply a means to disavow the more vexing truth that the imagined consensus among black artists was just that, imagined. The black modernist's own radicality, her socially creative stance of non-fixation on racism, severely undermined that consensus, the very idea of that consensus. Abstraction was an extremely disruptive presence on this scene, and CBAA exploited that. Even the coalition's most strenuous advocacy could only do so much for independents like Ed Clark, whose wonderful and pioneering 1957 untitled Abstraction is on view right now upstairs and across the campus. Like Ed Clark, Loving, Edwards, Eversley, Alma Thomas, Sue Irons, Sam Gilliam, Richard Hunt, Howard E. Pindell, Ray Saunders, Jack Whitten, Bill Williams, and many, many others. Through its difficulty, their art pointed up the impossibility of thinking about race categorically, let alone as something that a work of art might be capable somehow of capturing. It could remind viewers that art develops according to private laws that aren't adjustable to a viewer's own extravagant needs. It could demonstrate that when one doesn't think of culture and art as discretely monolingual, coherently structured edifices, the interplay of realist expectations and abstract forms offered a lens onto the contested and dynamic character of the moment. CBAA's formal opening on April 6, 1971 spurred a renewal of the previous year's protest activities, which now glared under a media spotlight. The intense need to discern the blackness of the exhibition that Doty had constructed led to considerable frustration on critics' parts. The New York Times review opened in this way. Contemporary black artist in America, which opened yesterday, is not very black and not very good, but it has a couple of black spots that are very good indeed. Yes, end quote. That reviewer, John Kanaday, had gone to the show in search of black rage, but found only one big vanilla pudding. This is what he wrote, I shit you not. In one of the few works of social commentary that Doty selected for inclusion in the exhibition, Kanaday claimed to discern, quote, as forceful an expression of black rage as I have ever seen in a picture, end quote. What might have been productive about the scarcity of such works was completely lost on Kanaday. Black Artists in Rebuttal ran concurrently at the Acts of Art Gallery at 15 Charles Street in the West Village, organized by a subchapter of the coalition, and the sculptor Thom Lloyd, who previously had agreed to show in the Whitney survey, pulled out and inserted in what would have been his place a self-published and self-distributed volume called Black Art Notes, which collected 8 commissioned essays intended to function as a counterstatement to the introduction, the catalog of contemporary black artists in America. Oh, sorry. I'm behind a slide, sorry. This is a kind of preview in minuscule of the series of solo exhibitions at the Whitney that preceded the survey exhibition. Sorry, and this on your left is the title page to the rebuttal show catalog and the cover and the first page of Black Art Notes. And here's a little bit of snack for, but anyway, so Lloyd lined the inside covers of his book with exhortations from Black nationalist heroes to the Black artist. His book promised what he called a concrete affirmation of Black art philosophy as interpreted by 8 Black artists. In addition to imputing Doty, contributors also dealt handily with the many Black modernists at their disposal, whom they regarded as fluky after effects of race mixing, color distortion, and other topical threats. In a manner consistent with the priorities of cultural nationalism, Black Art Notes projected the fantasy of a Black art world purged of deviance from consensus, cleansed of what one of the writers called the nauseating conformities of self-denying Negroes. Amiri Baraka's contribution to Black Art Notes holds a special interest, not simply because it foregrounds the vexing figure of the Black modernist. Here's Baraka, quote, "It's too late to trot out figments of the white imagination posed as Black artists. The Richard Hunts and Barbara Chase-Ribouds and other less serious names do not actually exist in the Black world at all," end quote. Although this cruel assertion is clearly a fantasy, given such people's incontestable existence, Baraka's formulation helps us to understand that these individuals represented an excess for which nationalists simply couldn't be bothered to account. His essay characterizes authentic Black art in emphatically spatial terms. Here's Baraka again. This desire of the African personality to reassert itself, and very consciously, is the eruption of a counterform into the closed field of white definition, end quote. At the Whitney, however, the closed field that had been punctured was that of the nationalist imagination, and the only hope for its restoration lay in a compensatory image of a Black world in which such people did not exist. Few reactions to CBAA reflected the exhibition's own understanding of its subject, but the exhibition floor plan shows that Doty installed or intended to install abstract works at points of particularly dramatic emphasis, where they'd be maximally disruptive. Frank Bolling's Colosso, Where is Lucien? held a small wall just inside the entrance to the exhibition. Doty intended to set a magenta-toned acrylic disc by Fred Eversley 6 feet in diameter upon a pedestal in the middle of a traffic flow and positioned to catch, color, and throw into the surrounding space the broad shaft of light that enters through that window overlooking 77th Street in the afternoon. His plan also shows Thom Lloyd's electric light construction, Musaku, which is a full-color work. That's a black and white photograph of it. It's also striking a rather strongly tone-setting note, and had Lloyd not withdrawn it, it would have enjoyed a room unto itself very early in the exhibition sequence. So placed in this exhibition, such works would be found firmly within what was understood to be Black culture, the idea of which they nevertheless destabilized by figuring it abstractly. The theme, contemporary Black artists in America, mandated a kind of spectatorial multitasking. One could look at once at art and for race, but the show's contents prevented Blackness achieving anything like a robust presence. The fixed color attitude that proponents of Black arts avowed, and which Americans saw everywhere reflected in ubiquitous reports about the nation's race problem, had no place here, really. One had choices to make about what to recognize in what one saw. Abstraction's emergence within the space of Black art undermined the very idea of a cultural representative. Freedom from representation was now a working principle, a starting point for these individuals. They sought no control over the viewer's thoughts. They trusted in a modernist fantasy wherein one's discipline was a precious and sustaining place, a kind of dwelling, where one continually refined and then oneself extended oneself into viewing situations, each of which carried the promise, not guarantee, of recognition. This Black show, by promoting rather than burying the reality of aesthetic dissent within Black America, pointed up the asymmetrical relationship of some individuals to the reputed community. The vulnerability and openness of this individual, embodied on this scene by an object devoid of image, was clearly antithetical to the nationalist attitude, which characteristically was oppositional in disposition and declamatory in tone. If an identification with modernist painting and sculpture was tantamount to defection from the Black art world, or grounds for expulsion from such, its reputation elsewhere in the left art culture was similarly compromised at this moment. This is the cover of Art Forum in March of 1971, just to give you a feel for sort of what new art, what the sexy new stuff looked like. It didn't look like this. Where's the pointer? It didn't look like this. It looked like this is Richard Serra embedded in the road in the Bronx. Pardon me, the most exciting new art was unanchored by wall or pedestal. It might unfold across a screen or just turn up along the path of a stroll or a drive. It might be presented somewhere wholly apart from art's traditional spaces. It was probably durational and possibly interactive. It might not even be recognizable to most people as art. Many influential critics of the day reserved their most vociferous approval for actions more closely resembling the BECC's activities than they did for those of painters and sculptors, painters and sculptors like those who concern me here. But among other effects, the long shadow that this new art activity cast over modernist painting and sculpture also made possible experiments that were unimaginable when those mediums were de rigueur. Abstraction of the kind featured at the Whitney was an indispensable aspirational paradigm, and many artists discussed their work in language that clearly telegraphs this. The first of the BECC instigated events at the Whitney was Al Loving's solo exhibition in the winter of 1969-70. On the left-hand side, this is just an image of the brochure, the cover of the brochure, and then the other works that I'll discuss in a moment. In that exhibition, Loving showed 5 structural polyhedrons constructed from a total of 130 interchangeable canvases. Al Loving was born in 1935 in Detroit and died in 2005. In the interview that he gave to the Detroit News on the occasion of the exhibition's opening, Loving described the point of view from which his geometric abstraction originated. Quote, "I can't accept totally the idea of pure color. Without some kind of rational vehicle, color becomes an indulgence." End quote. That vehicle for Loving at that moment, and continuing for another 6 years precisely, was the cube. The cube. Its resonance for Loving went beyond its capacity somehow to mediate the pure color attitude. Quote, "As I become more involved with outside things, I began working with the cube as my only subject. And almost uniformly open, Al Loving's cube is an unnervingly mobile device. He created Septahedron 34, 1970, in the prolific season just following his solo exhibition at the Whitney. This large-scale painting presents the eponymous form illusionistically and in optical color, perforated and fitted to a hexagonal support with which the painted figure literally fights. We view the form from an elevated oblique angle, facing the frame-like triangular surface that remains after a large section of the cube has been sheared away. The septahedron sits awkwardly in the flat space of the canvas, attached but not reconciled to the latter's shape, whose straight directionals agree with the figure's torqued orientation. Loving leaves the resulting tension unresolved. What he gives us to consider, to tackle, really, is a super flat image of a very complexly articulated volume. We experience the cube's opening of the surface's closure as quite emphatic. The septahedron appears as though held by a force, the lessening of which by even the smallest degree could propel the image further off kilter, if not off of the wall. A similar strain pervades the work. the septahedron's geospatial tension has a certain echo in the optical colors: cadmium pink, cadmium red light, orange, yellow, and blue, applied by Loving in varying densities to the exterior and interior surfaces of the painted form, which comprises a medley of geometric shapes due to the sheared corner and the obstructed view of the cube's inner volume. In 1970, Loving called the cube, quote, a self-portrait that offers a means of expressing horizontal feelings toward things. "I can't stand pictures that just sit there," he said. Indeed, an encounter with Septahedron 34 promotes horizontal feeling of a strong and strange kind. In the body's registration, not of a self-affirming equality with the hexagonal support, but rather of the septahedron's inclination to rest free of that support. One reaches this understanding through two distinct perceptual actions, both demanded by the illusion. Although seemingly lost to the painting's dysmorphosis, ultimately the cube qua cube can be recovered by the mind. It has a kind of gestalt that assures that we can recover the known form from the fragmented septahedron before us. Whatever means we employ to recover the cube, one comes to understand Loving's picture. One comes to the significance of this form right here by reference to the disfigurement of a convention. The second action is comparatively incidental. It carries us past the painting's surface and through the large triangular aperture facing us at the cube's severed corner. Such a gesture might be utterly without consequence were it not for its explicitly horizontal directionality. Its rhyme with Loving's language for feelings towards things is almost harshly literal. But it is from within this unpredictably plausible interior that one best apprehends how Loving constructed Septahedron 34, so as to accentuate its reality as a painted, not a built thing. The thing in the painting is too full of tectonic irregularity to serve as a structure for anything other than an image. What with all that loose edging, non-aligned rays, tonal shifts that do not track to logic, and a surface alienating from flat to stippled, both loosening and tightening surface. It remains solid only for as long as one can feel in sync with the broken, asymmetrical form that Loving excavates from the symmetrical schema that is a cube, and that isn't long. There's no describing the bright, bizarre construction on the wall that doesn't pass one through some structural crisis in which formal convention and the artist's adjustment to it form the two halves of a terminally fraught whole. In this way, Septahedron 34 recalls but a few of the innumerable ways in which structures, generally, fail to capture phenomena as we experience them, which is to say, in all of their mobile, decentering effects. The painting becomes an article of our experience by demanding from us a practical relationship to vision, not just dumb sight of the sort that overwhelms the particulars by recovering a cube from Loving's adulterations. The high degree of viewer involvement that Loving's geometry requires merely extends the artist's own effort to explore structure rather than merely to assert it, to depict the modulations, blind spots, decompressions, and delocalizations upon which all structures tremble. Throughout this period, Loving continually staged disclosures of structures' interiors, not to reveal them, but to destabilize something fixed. For instance, this is him again speaking in 1972, I think it was, "I'm enclosing internal spaces in the cube so that I can do more with color." Loving's art and statements suggest that he imagined not his eccentric geometry alone, but the whole experimental apparatus of which it was a part, as a refutation of what he had called the pure color attitude. We cannot say whether he was aware or ignorant that these remarks gain a special resonance from their historical coincidence with national languages for art, nationalist languages for art. But surely the instituted order among black artists, circa 1971, from which Loving was but one of many deviators, could also have been called a pure color situation. The two have a strong conceptual nearness that we would do well to acknowledge, but not to overdetermine. As we have seen, racial blackness was meant to be experienced as a structure. It was neither desirable nor possible to exceed, with artists, objects, and entire exhibitions expected to embody and ennoble that ideal. Artists like Loving upended that structure in ways both literal by working beyond the strict thematic parameters of black art, and metaphorical, by working color against its instituted symbolizations. The coincidence of these two kinds of color work, one explicitly cultural, one explicitly artistic, invites us to think color in both senses as relational rather than substantial in nature. Its structures, rather than being determined by essential characteristics, are determined by differences, to whose presence we are constantly alerted by the vividness of the materials, hues, shapes, textures, and effects that give these artworks their distinctive character. Loving's particular use of abstraction returns us repeatedly to its facility of refraction. The artist's perversions of structure gain a special critical force vis-a-vis the principles governing, at the time, thought about the black world. I'm not assigning them, him, or any others any critical motive here. I'm only remarking that their formal and verbal articulations stand in exceptionally sharp relief against their historical background. They upset almost every set of terms that we have to account for the history, the self-concept, and the purview of the Black American artist. They remind us, too, that it takes special intervention to make a work of art black. They draw our attention to the enormous conceptual gulf separating the idea of black culture from the black modernist art practitioner. And they movingly evoke the combination of seriousness and pleasure that some people took in inhabiting that space between. These individuals thought, created, and moved along diagonal rather than straight lines in the social fabric. And these factors made their commitment to abstraction a radical creative force. Art wasn't just something that one made. One collaborated with one's practice and followed its leads. One risked oneself for it, opened oneself to change by it. Through it, one deepened one's embeddedness in the widest possible field of social and cultural relations. These artists moved towards the other and the indeterminate. One's practice was an entirely self-governed realm, but one's art was for someone else. It was for a viewer to whom one opened oneself up with a kind of consummate vulnerability. You spoke of your work's capacity, its desire even, to reward open perception by revealing or becoming something that you didn't intend. To speak of one's art in this way was precisely not to describe what should be seen or felt while looking at it. It was merely to describe one's hope that the work would find itself, as it were, in a serious relationship. This is the spread introducing the catalog essay for contemporary black artists in America. When Robert Doty gave the lion's share of CBAA to artists making abstract art, the exhibition became a fragmented and therefore representative picture of the black artist's situation circa 1971. It was one thing to worry about black artists' divided loyalties, and quite another to try to understand this condition. I think this is just me here. Well, it's all just me here, but this is one of the more controversial elements. Doty used the exhibition medium, the research process, the hang, and the essay to do just that. Division was a contemporary historical development that audiences of every color could do well to reckon. In a way, the black modernist was a new kind of historical subject, an improbable manner of being within black culture as it was then being conceived. His catalog essays, frank formulations of abstraction as a counter-development, exhibit a modesty that belies his penetrating comprehension of the condition of U.S. culture in 1971. In an oblique but devastating blow to black art ideology, Doty writes that, quote, "A rational approach to complex artistic problems is neither convenient nor expedient for the black artist, but some are facing the dilemma. Their command of means is significant, but it is their ambition and integrity which demand respect. Ultimately, the black artist and his audience must respond to the authority of the created thing, that unique quality which flourishes under a spirit of free inquiry. The need for that freedom was never greater," end quote. CBA was, by all evidence, a conscious attempt to clear some conceptual space for this idea. In this setting, Black America was not a homogeneous population with a single urge. It was a cluster of conflicting motives. This was a representable fact. His is now Doty's again, the conception of the black artist sees it or thinks it as a discursive form, produced historically and recently subjected to transformation as more and more practitioners shed the label and formulated practices at a new distance from the clan. Their art was decidedly not an art of distantiation, however. Each did her own thing. But the development itself was salient and warranted underlining. Among other things, their output, originating in extensive interchanges with their non-Black colleagues and advocates, evidenced significant interracial activity in a rudely divided and divisive culture. Circa 1971, this was Black art that de-emphasized race. Emerging as it did from a mixed situation, it demanded the creation of new concepts for thinking about the relationships between art and cultural difference. In this arena of cultural pursuit, both race and color, two of the most defining products of the quantifying mind, begin to lose their shape. This was evident from the very first view of contemporary Black artists in America. The exhibition's establishing shot was Loving's colossal, multicolored geometric wall construction, Win Time Trip 1. At this point, and many others throughout the show, one had no choice but to wonder at the wild divergence between color's symbolic stability in Black art ideology and the extreme chromatic instability in a lot of the art that discourse would purport to explain. Abstraction of this kind subjects color to a completely antithetical type of discipline, one better described as non-descriptive, capricious, and questing. In a word, it delocalizes color. Acting upon color toward outcomes that meaning could not convey, this art broke the traditional bond between the Black producer and the artwork as a dependable racial signifier. Time Trip 1 gave the exhibition goer no way around this complex. As soon as the elevator reached the third floor galleries and its doors parted, one's attention was seized by and fixed on the sight of this single huge and difficult object, on the work in the art on display, and the work it was doing on the color concepts with which one was likely to have arrived. The perfect vehicle to engage viewers with the exhibition's questions, Time Trip 1 brought the problem of definition quickly to the fore. What is this thing? What about the Black artist in America? How will I figure it out? What does it matter? It put color to ends that were totally incongruous with the social logic of color we look to Black artists and Black shows to uphold. One viewer harumphed, quote, "The first impression is of large spots of bright color, pretty enough on the white walls," end quote. What was clear? What was clear was that CBAA's account of racial color would be emphatically non-foundational. Loving's construction, 27 feet across and 12 feet high, comprises multiple hexagonal canvases, each divided into 3 clearly outlined regions of color. Their combination by the artist results in a situation where chromatic harmony and discord do not only combine, but determine how the eye travels across the array. This movement produces questions too. Is the overall picture an assembly of adjacent cubes or teeming lozenges, a multifaceted solid, or an amalgam of discrete parts? The work doesn't indicate answers to these questions. Changes in hue further dynamize the relations among these units, drawing some hexagons closer together while pushing others apart. If the overall form holds, it's because the units share contours. The ambiguity of the common contour is aggravated, however, by the fact that each line has a distinct character, a different chromatic intensity or amplitude, depending on whether we see it flatly or in deep space, that is, as the single edge of a hexagon or as the outer limit of a cube, or depending on how its color is impacted by the play among adjacent hues' shadows. Edges become interstices and flatness becomes depth, and the interchanges themselves also vary in interest and structural importance. Color at most times appears wildly disproportionate to itself. Sometimes it seems poorly chosen or not always evenly applied, and its internal tonalities shift enormously with even the smallest change to one's viewing position. The spatial effect of the total composition is neither wholly convex nor concave. It comprises figures that force it to work in both ways. A tremendously bold act of ambiguation, Loving's picture is a cultural expression completely ungoverned by a center. Time Trip 1 involves itself with a space beyond it by means of the axonomic projection Loving used to produce it. He turns the painting's volumes obliquely so as to suggest their infinite extensibility into both background and foreground space. The picture employs axonometry almost to the point of frenzy, the play of textures and color chords accentuating the already excited interchangeability of receding and projecting surfaces and spaces. Some of these cubic forms open, while others remain closed. It's like it's like a really disciplined psychedelia. Very hard to reconcile the two, but that's precisely how it feels. These distortions effectively displace the viewer from the stationary triangle point, which is the foundation of perspective. To see Loving's construction, we need what Joseph Albers called free vision. Movements are not confined to one direction, but interchange. The solid volume shifts to open space and open space to volume. Masses moving first to one side may suddenly appear to be moving to the opposite side or in another direction. We cannot remain in a single viewpoint. We need more for the sake of free vision. To be sure, Doty's placement of this work at the top of the show announced a main idea of the exhibition with stunning clarity. The question of a work's relation to the framework would be ever present, and therefore unavoidable. At the moment of maximum visual information in the exhibition, in fact, the subject went out of sight. What made contemporary Black artists in America activist was the careful intelligence with which it exploited the newfound flexibility and dimensionality that color structures, and their cultural meanings had acquired late in the civil rights era. However, indirectly, the exhibition revealed other forms that radical aesthetics could assume. If by 1971 abstraction of this nature was radical only in this Black art world, within those confines, the modernist project recaptured a political dimension whose loss had seemed assured for quite some time. Inadvertently, modernist painters and sculptors and those who supported them and showed them had made a politics out of their optimism. In this way, it substantially enlarged the public's view of the moment of subjective creativity within Black culture by fixing a gaze on the point at which that became indistinguishable from North American culture per se. Thanks very much. Yeah, questions are great, if anybody has them. Love questions. Yep.
On the second slide that you showed of the protest at the Met,
Yep.
was that Norman Lewis
Oh, maybe.
inside that was leading the protest?
Yes, that's not Norman, no. Here? I can't make my point of it. That's not Norman. What would it mean to you if it were?
No, I'm just asking was it Norman Lewis?
Ah. Yep, there's one in there. Can we bring the lights up a little bit so I can see people? Thanks.
Test. Hi, I'm going to try to summarize my question as quickly as possible. I'm really, first of all, thank you for this. I'm working on curating a show to deal with this very question because I found that the Septahedron 34 and then when Time Trip 1 like very accurately describe how it feels to encounter the question of like Blackness as an artist, and I found that the issue, at least for myself, is that essentially to even confront the question sort of turns my artistic practice almost into like propaganda for like revolutionary action, which is necessary, yet I turn to art for freedom as well. And so as a Black person making art, it's kind of like hindered me, I guess, because I no longer perceive art as necessarily being something that is free. And you know, I think we perceive modern art as being free, but you could also argue that it's actually Eurocentric propaganda on the other side. So I think now what I'm asking you is for some guidance, which is how, like, for example, Solange at Guggenheim very much embraced, you know, Blackness and asserting Blackness, and I don't want to like escape my responsibility, but how do I move forward with any degree of freedom as an artist if I'm Black? But there is a responsibility we have. If I like Basquiat, for example, didn't claim to really make like black art overtly, yet now my generation like uses his crown as a symbol of black liberation. So now we're actually reappropriating
Good.
a black artist against himself.
Good. So first, I mean it when I say stop thinking so hard, by which I mean don't consciously do things that are going to put you in your own way in your studio. That's the only really free space anywhere, and it's made less so the more of your baggage you bring in, the less free it gets. So whatever it means to keep the baggage outside is what I think sounds like a better predicament to be in as a worker. As far as the Basquiat thing, you just articulated one of the really I think the best ways forward. If it is true that what Basquiat's disavowals of representativeness mean to you and your cohort is, if his disavowals mean that's what responsibility looks like, or that's what an art exercised in a spirit of responsibility looks like, just keep going with that, because it's not what you're seeing. But if that's what you need, if that's a misprision that you need to work under, by all means. I mean, people have been productive in spaces of factual interpretive incorrectness forever, right? There are ways to make that misprision work for you. If that's what freedom looks like, it doesn't matter what he was saying, right? I mean, if there's something you can learn from, even if it means working imitatively for a period of time, then stick with it. But there are basic questions like get yourself in front of a Basquiat and say, like, what makes this work as a painting, if it's a painting, and what makes it work as a means of thinking about what it is that I need to do to make art that I know is mine. But these are really questions. I mean, don't ask a black art expert. I don't believe in goddamn black art experts. So I'm not about to start playing one on TV, as it were. So I think this is an area where I feel like I've already said more than I should. My responsibility at this moment is just to encourage you as best I can to keep thinking with your own head and working with your own hand, if it's your hand that you work with.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm also very interested in the problem of essentialism, which is a problem that seems to plague people of color, especially in a certain way. So we can say someone like Kara Walker makes work about being black, whereas we wouldn't say that Donald Judd makes work about being white. Or maybe I would say that, but I realize I'm in a minority. So So there were moments in your talk where it seemed like, okay, these artists are trying to combat essentialism, but then there were also these moments where it seemed like where you were gesturing towards these type of artists cause us to reconfigure the concepts we use to think about art and cultural production, or that it's maybe a model for a new kind of artist or a new kind of being that's being ushered in. So I was curious to hear more about that.
Essentialism. I mean, it's a little. I don't know. I don't really feel. I was saying this to a colleague the other day. Let me figure out a concise way to say this. I want to just do the Kara thing, because everyone in here knows who Kara Walker is. I don't think she makes art about being black.
But it's possible for someone to say that about.
Sure, and of course that's
That's the problem.
Without that possibility, I would be nothing, right? But I think the thing is, how does one configure one's approach such that one isn't always starting from the easiest thing to say about a Kara Walker or a Donald Judd. There's no need to repeat that stuff. It's been done to death. The exciting thing about the ingression of thousands of cliches into a discourse about a single artist is that it makes every subsequent moment an opportunity to start another conversation, whatever that means. There's a lot of other stuff that Kara's doing, has been doing, is doing, will continue to do, that has nothing to do with that doesn't get noticed, really doesn't even get seen when the optic trains itself on this thing that she's ostensibly always talking about or always trying to get out from under. And one could list out tens of alternative starting points, conceptual and actual, for the art and genius, if that's what it is, of Kara Walker. I think it is a genius, in fact. But even that's very differently configured than than the genius of Picasso or whomever else. And it's because it's aware of what genius has been. And she's been very smart about orienting herself to the history of the practices in which she participates, not only as a black person, but as a draftswoman. Principally, I think, especially now, when she sort of laid down the silhouette, laid down the spectacle, and she's just having a really good time being an amazing draftsman again, and relearning her own art from her hand, where it all lives. That's, I think equally interminable is the list of things that the cultivation of that practice, that uniquely high level and concentrated intelligence in the practice. The list of things that work allows us to think about, not at the starting point phase, but like what is productive about it, and like what are its effectivities, right? Not just the entailments at the beginning that make the work happen, but the things that it shows us, or the kinds of light that it sheds on every single one of its subjects, and art and non-art included. That's just to me. I would rather keep moving forward and using the light that the art provides to risk a really conservative sounding formulation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't think it does, but that's all I got.
That's a hard question.
I mean, if you're saying so, fine. But I think I feel like there's a question that the question is pregnant with another curiosity that I didn't quite get to. But maybe we can talk during the reception. Mr. T, coming at me.
No. Then I'll just follow up to maybe ask you a question about art historians and journalists and museums at the very moment that an artist is maybe trying to break away, the museum may need something else, or the journalist might need something else. The journalist on the street in 69 or 71 may be attempting to incite something and is borrowing the moment, whatever the moment is that the artist is in, is saying, oh, actually this thing means that. And so and it seems like a kind of failure of journalism to, that journalism would then not even just say the easiest thing because they think they're talking to an 8th grade audience or whatever they say about that, but then say a thing that is attempting in a way to demean the complexity of the artistic practice for the sake of a kind of sociability or some kind of social ambition.
I just flatly agree with all that, and I would just add that I think another motivator in that moment can be, for the sake of not having to be the person who changes the conversation. It's a lot to take on, because if people are going to come back to you and ask you to refine your terms and have you do it again, and well, is the conversation really that different? Like, how far does the scope in which that change finds its expression travel? If you're working a beat, my beat is my beat, And that guy Kanaday was somehow on the black art beat. It's like the idiot who put Hilton Kramer on the modern art beat. Did that with Kanaday, and now we have these incredible texts. But
My more poignant question then is about how we teach art history, or how we teach others to see. And is there room in art history to ever teach a scholar?
How we teach our history or art history?
Art history. Art history, sorry.
Art history, okay.
Are we teaching people to see based on historical trajectories of seeing? Or are we teaching people to develop languages whereby they might see?
I think we can do both. I'm trying to do both all the time. I teach a class at Chicago, an introductory class that does not introduce by way of here's how to look at a picture and talk about what it is, here's how to look at a sculpture or a building and to talk about what it is. Just use the words you have already and let's try to shape them into something cogent and apt. And it's the hardest thing I do in my classroom and the funnest thing I do in my classroom. But what makes it hard, the hard parts are the parts where I'm having to synthesize into some actually cogent pedagogical transmission or response, whatever it means to do both at the same time. Let's figure out how to see. Let's not forget that this thing avails itself to vision in ways that are historically specific. A Carl Andre floor piece isn't not thinking. It's hoping for someone who knows that before its moment of emergence or actualization, sculpture didn't orient itself to space that way. It doesn't benefit from a transaction where it's, oh yeah, cool, tiles, cool, and I can walk on, cool. That's not. It depends crucially on an awareness or a registration of awareness that before that sculpture worked differently. Before that, the floor was the floor and art went on it. It wasn't coterminous with the floor. It's not coterminous with an Andre either, but that difference is very easy to overlook, right? So I think it's hard as heck to do both. But it's the only way I know how to teach.
There's time for one more question.
I don't think there is one. Oh, no, I don't think there is one. Oh, yeah, there is. Phil Donahue.
Loving go to Yale, and is there some sort of academic versus not academically trained situation at this time?
Well, sure, like every other time, there are some artists who go to school and others who don't, but Al Loving did not go to Yale. He visited Yale. Josef Albers his work and teaching were widely available in museums like the DIA and publications. He was obsessed with Albers Square. He was obsessed with Stella, and unlike some of his colleagues, he made a self-conscious choice not to copy Stella at first. He took Stella to pieces, and then he was borrowing structure from Stella and color from Noland. I think he had to have had an awareness of the Yale thing. Peter Bradley, who did the other exhibition in the book, the Deluxe Show, did go to Yale for a period of time and left. He wants me to believe that he did it voluntarily, but I'm pretty sure Peter was thrown out. But left because he had color laws that one couldn't really observe, under the teaching rubric that was in place then. But it varies according to figure. Al Loving did a thing at Wayne State that, from what I can tell, corresponds to like a post-bac MFA kind of situation. But I think he was largely a self-educated modernist.
Please join me in thanking Darby English.